Grüezi miteinander und ganz herzlich willkommen zu unserem Security Forum heute Nachmittag. Wir haben folgende Punkte auf der Agenda. Ich würde zuerst gerne vorstellen, wie in SEIA der Schritt in die Zukunft sieht. Das wäre Teil 1, Teil 2. Das ist der Kern vom heutigen Nachmittag, das Referat vom Dtx Cunningham zum Thema Zero-Trust. Und gegen Ende würde ich Ihnen noch ein Produkt herstellen, das wir entworfen haben, um zu schauen, wie dass wir das Homeoffice verdaut haben und wie wir uns vor allem aufstellen, dass es gegen vorne besser funktioniert. Und mit dem würde ich loslegen. Ich schaue zurück auf das Thema Enterprise Mobility. Wir haben gestartet, Grössenordnung 1999 mit BlackBerry. Sie mögen sich vielleicht erinnern. Ein absolut wegbereitendes Produkt, das als Einheit hergekommen ist, mit einem Backend mit Gerät. Also wirklich ein geschlossenes System, hat aber auch hervorragend funktioniert. Hat sich aber auch fokussiert auf das Thema Mail, Kalender, Kontakt, damals PIM-Daten. Es hat dann verschiedenste Veränderungen gegeben. Die grösste 2007 mit dem Erscheinen vom iPhone, wo es ermöglicht hat, mit Touchscreen verschiedene Bedienungen, Use Cases sind so viel einfacher zu brauchen als vorher, entweder über Tastatur oder mit den Stiftchen, die wir auch gehabt haben, eine Zeit lang. Und ein weiterer Meilenstein natürlich die Gründung von Go for Mobile. Im Anschluss ist Android gekommen als Alternative zum iPhone, Nokia-Geräte, Symbian etc. ist weggebrochen. Und die zwei, iPhone und Android, haben den Markt unter sich aufgeteilt. Es hat noch etwas Windows gegeben, aber es hat nie wirklich eine relevante Marktgröße erreicht. Aber in Summe, was ist möglich gewesen mit diesen neuen Gerätetypen? Wir können zugreifen auf Daten, Daten beliebiger Natur in Anführungszeichen und somit auch Zugriff auf Intranet, Zugriff auf Shares. Also eigentlich das meiste, was man braucht im Bereich nicht strukturiert zu arbeiten. Ein bisschen später sind Cloud-Ressourcen dazugekommen. Cloud-Ressourcen, wo wir alternativ zu Ressourcen von On-Prem heute immer mehr einsetzen. Wir kennen es aus dem Privaten, aber genauso hat sich das auch im geschäftlichen Bereich etabliert. Und dann irgendwo 2019 irgendwie so ein bisschen das Bild von dieser ganzen Zunahme und diesen Möglichkeiten, die immer mehr geworden sind. 2019 haben wir eine Penetration von SIM-Karten in der Schweiz von 11,3 Millionen, schon recht eine eindrückliche Zahl. Das heisst, weit über ein Gerät pro Person. Und das, der Reifegrad, die ganze Entwicklung vom Markt hat es dann veranlasst, auch ein bisschen zu schauen, wie sieht es aus, wie reif ist die Enterprise Mobility und wie geht es weiter. Wir sind zum Schluss gekommen, dass Enterprise Mobility unterdessen nicht mehr wie 2007 etwas Spezielles war, sondern heute ist es einfach integraler Bestandteil vom Arbeitsplatz. Etwas, was wir einfach haben müssen. Und wenn Sie Ihre Kinder, junge Mitarbeiter fragen, dann ist das für die nichts mehr Spezielles, sondern selbstverständlich natürlich. Aber warum redest du vom Smartphone, ist ja eh klar, dass darüber alles geht. Das hat uns veranlasst, in die Zukunft zu schauen. Wir haben zu dem Zweck mal geschaut, an was sind wir überzeugt, dass wird stattfinden. Es ist ein bisschen eine Bestandesaufnahme auch. Es ist ganz klar, dass die Menge Endgeräte und Endgerättypen enorm am Zunehmen ist. Wir haben natürlich Smartphone, wir haben auch den Laptop, aber wir haben immer mehr auch Smartwatches, VR-Brillen, beliebige Endpunkte, die dazukommen, die um uns herum so eine digitale Welt kreieren. Auch unser Arbeitsverhalten, mehr oder weniger freiwillig, ist immer mehr auch unterwegs. Es liegt in der Natur des Menschen, unterwegs zu arbeiten, mobil zu sein. Aber jetzt sind wir auch gezwungen gewesen, viele von uns von daheim aus zu arbeiten. Das Homeoffice auferlegt durch Covid zeigt auch, dass die verschiedenen Modelle, die eigentlich schon da sind, parat sind, jetzt, je länger sie mehr zum Tragen kommen. Eine weitere Tendenz ist auch das eigene Office. Wir sehen das in Europa. Es ist in den USA noch ein bisschen etwas Stärkeres, das eigene Device, BYOD. Das ist nicht nur bezogen auf ein Smartphone, sondern es betrifft auch den Laptop, den PC. Das heisst, ich wähle als Mitarbeiter oftmals meine eigene Hardware und greife dann mit deren auf Firmeninfrastruktur zu. Es gibt ganz andere Aufgaben für uns aus der IT, selbstverständlich. Dann Cloud haben wir gehabt. Die Menge an Cloud-Services ist eindrücklich am Steigen. Kleine und kleinste Services können produziert werden. Es ist eine extrem innovative Welt. Auf der einen Seite, auf der anderen Seite sind es auch ganz klassische Anwendungen wie Mail, Vorreiter ganz klar M365, wo in Cloud geht, Microsoft, wo wo uns dorthin bewegt. Mit dem wollen und müssen wir uns beschäftigen. Und mit dem natürlich kommt es dazu, dass wir die heiklen Daten ein bisschen überall haben. Das heisst, wir sind ein bisschen auf verschiedensten Endpunkten, genauso wie auf den verschiedensten Services und Ressourcen, die wir arbeiten. Und wenn wir das anschauen, das sind unsere Erkenntnisse gewesen, die wir erarbeitet haben. Wenn wir das anschauen, Gartner kommt zu einem ähnlichen Schluss und hat ihren Top 10 Strategic Trends für 2020 da. Aus diesen 10 sind es 3, die sehr stark auf die Punkte einzahlen, die wir da selber erarbeitet haben. Das ist Multi-Experience, das heisst, das ist die unterschiedlichen Endgeräte, Endpunkte, Endgerätetypen, die da drin vereinigt sind. Auf der anderen Seite haben wir die Distributed Clouds. Es ist nicht nur eine Cloud, ich habe nicht nur einen Anbieter, sondern es ist die verteilte Cloud. Ich habe verschiedenste Anbieter, ich beziehe verschiedene Services von verschiedenen Orten. Das eine. Und der dritte Punkt, die Empowered Edge, wo uns die Rechenleistung her zum Endpunkt bringt, wo dafür sorgt, dass die Rechenleistung auch dort zur Verfügung steht, wo ich sie brauche. Dort ist Latenz ein riesen Thema, die müssen wir abschrauben, damit wir selbstfahrende Autos zum Beispiel wirklich fahren können, automatisiert. Wenn wir das ein bisschen anschauen und zusammenfassen, heisst es, dass Daten, die sind nicht mehr im Perimeter rein, das heisst, aussen ist das Neue rein. Das ist total neu vom Konzept her und aus dem heraus braucht es neue Konzepte, wo die neue Welt bedienen, wo damit umgehen, dass wir eben nicht mehr eigentlich am Tisch hocken und via gelbes Kabel mit dem Server verbunden sind, wo ebenfalls on-premise steht. Die Lösungskonzepte die gibt's schon ein Zeitchen. Forrester ist mit Zero-Trust seit etwa 2003 unterwegs. Das ist schon ein Zeitchen. Als Konzept, 2004 glaube ich sogar, und dort hat man gesehen, dass man die Notwendigkeit hat, nur mehr auf den Perimeter zu setzen, sondern Daten und die Identität ins Zentrum stellen. Die geflügelte Ziele ist Never Trust, Always Verify. Das hört man immer wieder im Zusammenhang mit Zero-Trust und zeigt sicher auch, wo der Weg hergeht. Das heisst, das Vertrauen per se, das schenken wir nicht mehr einfach, sondern das muss man unterwegs immer wieder verdienen. Die Karte auf der anderen Seite, geformt von Gartner, ist einen Schritt weiter gegangen und hat aus einem relativ statischen Zero-Trust eine dynamische Geschichte gemacht mit dem Continuous und Adaptive Risk and Trust Assessment, das heisst, man macht es laufend, man passt die Massnahmen immer und immer wieder an, abhängig vom Szenario, das im Moment gerade herrscht, von der Bedrohungslage, die herrscht. Kursiv geschrieben, die 2 Blöcke, Zero Trust und Karte, das sind Konzepte, man kann die nicht in Form von Produkten kaufen, wenn man so will. Die beiden Häuser sind dann weiter und haben ZTX, Zero Trust Extended auf der einen Seite, auf der anderen Seite bei Gartner Zero Trust Network Access und SASE geformt. Das sind Kategorien, wo effektiv dann auch Produkte drinnen geliefert werden. Und man sieht es auch sehr schön, beispielsweise in der Forrester Wave, analog am Gartner Magic Quadrant, dass im Bereich Zero Trust doch schon diverse Produkte rum sind, durchaus bekannte Hersteller, die anfangen, ihre Technologie so schmieden quasi, dass es möglich ist, mit denen einen Zero Trust Ansatz dann umzusetzen. Zero Trust werden nachher genau vom Chase Cunningham hören, wie das umzusetzen ist und was Kernelemente vor allem sind von dem. Ja, jetzt, wie sieht dann die Welt konkret aus? Das sind alles Konzepte. Wir sehen auf der einen Seite, auf der linken Seite Mitarbeitende, Leute, die über Endgeräte auf Daten zugreifen. Das ist das grosse Fragezeichen in der Mitte. Wir wollen für sie Lösungen bauen, mit ihnen zusammen Lösungen bauen, die dem Rechnung tragen, und zwar möglichst in einer Plattform, wo die Sicherheit und Connectivity über eine zentrale Stelle kann gemanagt und verwaltet werden. Dort sind die Produkte Klasse SASE und Zero Trust Network Access drin enthalten, und mit denen haben sie die Möglichkeit, effektiv eine sehr, sehr, sehr breite Gruppe von Endgeräten sicher an die verschiedenen Services anzubinden, ohne dass sie sich im Einzelnen darum kümmern müssen. Der zentrale Punkt in der Mitte sorgt dafür, dass die Policies konsequent durchgesetzt werden, und zwar für alle gleich, für jedes Endgerät gleich, aber auch für alle Services gleich. Und der grosse Vorteil ist, ich kann das zentral administrieren und es gilt unmittelbar für alle Beteiligten. Wenn man das ein bisschen zusammenfasst, haben wir für uns nachher gesehen, dass wir da in eine mega spannende Welt hineinkommen. Wir haben die Vision, dass sich alle sicher und einfach in diesen spannenden digitalen Welten bewegen können. Und wir als Firma wollen dafür sorgen, dass sie das mit gutem Gewissen machen können, dass sie nämlich Geschäftsideen schnell und unkompliziert können realisieren können, und wir sorgen dafür, dass die Endpunkte und Services einfach und gesichert können vernetzt werden. Jetzt, wenn wir das ein bisschen genauer anschauen und da unseren aktuellen Namen anschauen, Go for Mobile. Mobile, immer noch sehr zentral, immer noch ein grosses Bedürfnis von jedem Teilnehmer, selbstverständlich. Aber der Security-Gedanke, die Breite von den Themen, die wir haben auf der Endpunktseite, wie auch auf der Service-Seite, das ist uns als Core-Set vorgekommen, und darum haben wir entschieden, dass wir ein neues Kleid bekommen und einen neuen Namen, und das ist in Seja mit dem Schild, das uns schützt gegen Gefahren, und die Einfachheit, die Usability selbstverständlich immer noch das Thema, darum Simply Secure. Wir sind die gleichen Leute, wir haben die gleiche Begeisterung für das Thema und unsere Arbeit, die gleiche Begeisterung, unsere Kunden zu bedienen. Und mit genau deren Energie werden wir sie zukünftig begleiten im Rahmen von einer Strategie. Wie komme ich in so eine Zero-Trust-Welt? Welche Schritte muss ich machen? In welcher Reihenfolge vielleicht auch? Und dann selbstverständlich tun wir auch Anlagen für sie designen, planen, bauen und betreiben, so dass sie sich wirklich aufs Kerngeschäft konzentrieren können. Und mit dem kommen wir schon zum zweiten Teil. That's where I switch to English to welcome you, Dr. Chase Cunningham. I'm really excited to have you today, and that we can learn how to apply what the core elements of Zero Trust are, and how we can apply that so that in the end we have a secure infrastructure that suits the needs of our workforce. Dr. Chase Cunningham, quite an impressive CV. What are his activities? He actually helps leaders to implement security into their organization and make sure that we use very modern security concepts to accomplish that level of security that we need, and that we also have to provide to our business so that they can perform in the best possible way. One of his topics that he also covers is artificial intelligence and how this can be adapted to make our infrastructure even more secure. He's a very accomplished specialist in the field, in the security field. Has started out in the US Navy and has more than 20 years experience also working for different government agencies such as NSA, CIA, or FBI. He has 6 patents to his name and has written several books about cybersecurity. He works as a leader in threat intelligence for different companies, and has been in this role also for Armor and other companies. He holds a PhD and has a master in information technology from the University of Colorado, and has a Bachelor of Science from the American military. And with this, I would like to hand it to you.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. As soon as I am able to present here, I'll start to, and let's see.
Now we're good.
All right, great. So we're going to talk about in 2020 how the world has gone to zero trust. If you're not familiar with this, we'll run through what this is and kind of where it came from, and we'll cover some of the intricacies of this strategy. So in 2020, Zero Trust ZT, which is what I'll call it for the rest of this because you guys don't want to hear me say Zero Trust 1,000 times, has become basically the ad hoc standard for the United States government. It's been adopted by the DoD over here. It's being adopted in APAC and EMEA as well. It's very big for international banking and essentially is becoming an industry standard strategy. And we'll talk about why that is. First, I want to talk about a couple of other things that are applicable in this space. So we'll talk about what the next exploitation or hack is going to look like. I'm going to give you some information on where Zero Trust or ZT came from. and then I'll talk to you a little bit about what operationalizing ZT means, especially in a post-COVID remote mobile world. So there's always this question from people is like, what will the next hack look like? Well, in reality, the next hack is going to look a lot like the old ones unless we approach things differently, and I'll explain that in a minute. But if we look at a great example of what a kind of perfect state exploitation or hack looks like, it was OPM. If you're not familiar with OPM, that's the Office of Personnel Management for the U.S. government. It maintains, manages, and controls essentially every person within the DoD, which is millions of users' information. I was on a server, was the actual entry point. And basically, the point here is that this started in 2014. This was on a government system. U.S. government contained classified information. So you would think that this is probably the most secure server on the planet. I mean, I'm retired military. I used to work for the NSA. I worked at CIA, FBI. My information was on there. I would have thought that this was secure, but basically someone somewhere who worked for Keypoint Systems, a contractor for the DoD, clicked on a link that caused a compromise via phishing. They were able to leverage that to get into an admin account on a jump server inside of the infrastructure. And from there, they went into 10 additional boxes inside of the core VLAN infrastructure and ultimately wound up dropping 2,000 individual pieces of malware that allowed them to have 15,000 multiple connections within that infrastructure. So the point being, this was the US government in 2014, and you would think that the security controls there would have been so far above board that this was not even possible. Well, in reality, this is still possible today. There are still contractors, there are still third parties, everyone is remote now, and there are still accesses that will continue to allow this type of access to happen if organizations don't approach it from a different standpoint, because the government, the US DoD, had tried everything at that time. The concept of a perimeter does not function anymore, especially in post-COVID world. I'm not sure exactly how things are in Europe right now. I think you guys are probably doing a little bit better than we are in the US, but I know in the US, everyone is remote. As of March 13th, 2020, basically the perimeter dissolved. I'm at home working in my home office. Everyone that I know of is working from their home office. We're using our mobile devices, we're using our laptops. We are not inside the perimeter anymore. If anything, the perimeter, might have been secured by this piece of plastic here, but as of 2020, we are all way outside the bounds of the perimeter. So we have to approach things differently. We can't continue to secure things in the old manner and think that it's going to get any better. You can't necessarily train your way towards better cybersecurity. I do workshops all the time with major organizations, and they will look at it and they'll say, well, we've done a phishing test. Great. I've been a red teamer. I've worked for organizations that have had penetration tests and red teams, and I can tell you unequivocally, I've literally been to an organization the day after phishing and found individuals serially. And organizations will also say, well, we have a 1% click rate. A 1% click rate for an organization with 10,000 people is still an extremely large number when you only need one avenue of compromise. So we can't continue to train our way out of cybersecurity failure. And any organization that wants to digitally transform, which we all have to, we all need to nowadays, has to approach things differently. I like this one just because it's like, what if I told you the cloud is just someone else's computer? If you're relying on someone else's computer to be secure, that's an exercise in futility. Jeff Bezos does not necessarily care if Amazon is secure. He's selling you access, he's selling you capability, he's not selling you security. So remember that the approach to the cloud, which is where we're all going, is digital transformation, but the cloud is in actuality just another machine on another platform with the same security issues and controls as any other thing that you've dealt with in the past. Now the question comes up, well, what is zero trust? You were talking about this before. This is where things get pretty interesting for me. Zero trust, the tagline is never trust, always verify. For a long time, people have said, well, what is the definition of zero trust? And for years, we didn't really have one. This definition that I have here is my definition that's based on about a decade's worth of research. So let me read this for you. Zero trust is strategically focused on addressing lateral threat movement within the network by leveraging microsegmentation, which we mean at the grand context, and granular enforcement based on user context, data access control, location, application, and device posture. If you really boil it away and think about what you have to have the minimum standard for a secure infrastructure that revolves around the user, the device, and segmentation applied therein, this is what zero trust actually looks like. Now, I will say that there is no biblical definition of zero trust. The good thing about a real strategy, and one that has stood the test of time, is that anyone can have their own particular flavor of this thing and it still can work for you. You may not necessarily have some of the issues that someone else does. That's fine. You can still apply zero trust principles to that in order to get your own semblance of ZT. Now, the reason that I have the death of the password on the left there is if you approach zero trust with the manner that we're talking about, with the technologies that we're referencing, you can get towards a state where you ultimately can eliminate the password, or at the very least, minimize passwords. And the reason that that's so important is if you crawl through the history of exploitation, you will see that usernames and passwords, whether they're average users or admins or executives or whatever, is the primary avenue of compromise. If you can limit that, then you're improving security exponentially. The history of zero trust is actually much longer than what you probably have thought. Most people think that ZT kind of showed up on the market in 2017-ish, 2016-ish timeframe. Not true. Zero trust in its basic standard form has been around since 2003. The earliest reference you can find to it is a group called the Jericho Forum, which was basically a bunch of CISOs and academics in Australia and New Zealand who were thinking about what the security platform portfolio would look like for the future without the perimeter being the end-all be-all. And that was the formation of the Jericho Forum. Fast forward from there, they asked, well, how do we do that? In 2003, 2004, it was really around network access control and firewall. It was very network focused. As you go forward in time towards 2010 and 2014, when Microsoft starts talking about this, assuming breach, Google publishes Beyond Corp, they really moved from an area where they were thinking specifically about firewalls and NAC into one where they're talking about identity becoming a very key piece of this. Keep fast forwarding to 2016, 2017, and going forward, you can see that the move from NAC, firewall, whatever, has moved into conditional access, along with the ongoing passwordless side of it. But essentially, we've moved from hardcore network, because the network has now become transitory, especially as we're all remote, into an area where it revolves around the user, the accesses, the identity, and the device. So ZT has been around for nearly 20 years, and it's been evolving in that time. There are publicly available reference architectures for what zero trust looks like. Now, you talked quickly about the Dtx framework. That's my framework that I put together. And the reason that I think that that's so useful is because if you look at what's required for ZT, it's broken down into these categories: identities, devices, data, applications, infrastructure, network, all using visibility and analytics and all being coordinated by automation. And at the center of that, somewhere there's going to be a security policy enforcement capability. And basically what we mean is, if you've got these components, which if you look at what is required for security, which we'll just look at what is required for digital operations, these are those things. Sooner or later, somewhere in the middle, there's going to be a brain that's brokering all these connections and allowing this to occur. I'll show you how this looks in a regular workflow in just a second. But the point being, if you're in a space where you're trying to figure out, okay, well, I understand the history, I understand the validity of ZT, what does an architecture look like? There are lots of them out there that are publicly available. Microsoft has some. The US government has just published a standard NIST 800-207. There are other ones out there. So if you're looking to figure out how ZT should look from an architectural standpoint, 2 years ago, I couldn't point you to one. Now I can point you to about 50. So they're out there and they're available to look at. Now, if you take all that stuff away, what is the basic principles for ZT? What is the minimum things that we talk about? And this is where I think things get really interesting, because we're into the very simple problem that we're trying to solve. In essence, what you're trying to do is verify explicitly all the time, always applying least privilege access, and then always assuming breach. Until you can prove otherwise, assume that any asset, any user, any account, anything on that network is compromised. If you do these things, you are enabling ZT, verifying explicitly, always applying least privilege, and assuming breach. This is different than the days of perimeter. If you're inside my network, you're good. I verified and validated you when you came in. I'll give you the accesses that you think you need. And then I'm not going to assume breach. I'm going to think that anything in my perimeter is secure because it's my perimeter. We flip that on its head and approach it from this particular context. Now, to give you an idea of the simplicity around this, if you think about how this is working in today's digital enterprise, this is what it looks like. People need access to resources. I'm at home. I need access to my email. I need access to PowerPoint, those type of things. Somehow or another, this person needs access to that resource. That's how things work. Well, the only way that I get access to those resources in a digital enterprise is via a device. It might be a laptop. It might be my mobile phone. It might be an iPad, whatever it is. Somehow or another, a person is going to use a device to get to a resource. Home offices have thrown this in the spin too, because recently what you've seen is we've all been moved remote, right? So now we're even further outside of the perimeter, and most of us, especially here in the US, are using a personal laptop or a computer. And on top of that, most of us have not been told how to effectively secure the device. Becomes even more of a problem in the current state of infrastructure today. And I've also not thought about good operating setup. People are using their cell phones, which are unmanaged, which is an avenue of compromise. Employers are not putting new policies in place. And then a lot of people reuse passwords. Just to give you an idea on the password reuse, again, for the people using devices to get to resources, the average user has 90 accounts. If you think about how many users and how many accounts and how many passwords on how many devices, get really, really big, really, really quick. So you can see how this becomes a compounding problem. But going back to our how does ZT tie it into this, this is how it works. This person is using this device on a network to get to a resource. Now that network may or may not be managed, maintained, and controlled by my employer. It might be the network from the coffee shop at Starbucks. It might be my network here from home going over Comcast. It might be a network that is managed by the employer. If you apply ZT, the policy engine side of this, you essentially sit in the center of this and you look for contextual information to apply a control. What kind of information can I get from people, devices, and networks to apply a control to allow access to a resource? It might be I step up MFA. It might be I prompt for another login. It might be that I deny. Whatever it is, I'm using threat intelligence, analytics, telemetry, all these other cool things to apply a control to get those three tenets always applied as they access these resources. That's done with intelligence and automation. You can't do this one-to-one. You can't do this not at scale. You can't do this if you don't have infrastructure. We have to do this now because business necessitates this, especially in a post-COVID world. It might be a partner. It might be a contractor. It could be one of your customers, or interestingly enough, it could be a robot. Robots are actually sort of people nowadays. They get to things via devices on networks. The devices could be a laptop, a desktop, a phone, tablet, server. It could be an IoT device, could be a manufacturing floor piece of infrastructure. Whatever it is, somehow that device is going to access a network to get to a resource. That network, again, could be public, could be Starbucks Wi-Fi, could be the library Wi-Fi, could be private, could be my home network, or could be managed, could be on VPN, SDP, SDN to get towards that resource. And those resources, they might be old, they might be on-prem, they might be new, they might be SaaS, PaaS, or IaaS, but sooner or later somewhere, those resources are either on-prem or in the cloud. And the way that you verify this can be a variety of things. It could be the user's role, task, or type. The agent could be looking for the type. The agent, was it joined? Is it managed, unmanaged? Is it patched? And then the network. Is that network familiar to your organization? Is it anonymized? Is it a fake network that's already been attacked? Or is sending you attack, DDoSing you? And you're going to go to those resources, which also have capabilities for verify and validation, the publishing time, the scope, Is it classified or tagged? Does it have access to sensitive data? What version is it? Is it a regulated application? Does it contain that type of data? And the way that you do that with context is your engine is going to look at risk. It's going to look at threat intelligence. It's going to look at different habits. What time of day do I try and access? Did I just send a request for access from Kansas and 3 minutes later it comes from Moscow? That's probably indicative of a problem. Is there an anomaly? And then you're going to apply a control within that policy engine. I'll block it. I'll ask for additional authentication. I'll let someone else attest. Depending on the access to data, I might apply an additional encryption control. Or if that's my policy, I can just say, if none of this stuff is weird, I'll accept the terms and give you access. This is pretty simple when you actually break it down and use this, because it ultimately, what we're all trying to do with ZT policy across the entirety of this space is to secure data. People using devices on networks are going to have context looked at, and they're going to have a control applied that's going to allow access to a resource, because what we're trying to do is secure data. Data is the lifeblood of this whole thing. Zero trust applies therein, and this is how that works. An FTE is going to be on a domain joined device, so me using my mobile phone here that's managed by the company on an off-corp network. I'm at home, I'm at Starbucks to get to my email, which is in the cloud. How do I make that happen with my context? Well, the context says there's no real weird things happening. We're used to seeing Chase using this device. He's usually from Starbucks at this time of day. There's no anomalies. The only control I'm going to apply there, because everything looks okay, is an MFA sign-in. That's literally the simplistic version of requiring MFA for control of data from a user accessing email, which has got the vital data in it, across the entirety of a zero trust policy lifecycle. Now, the great thing about ZT is that we're in a space where there are 700 plus vendors in the space, and every one of them has got different capabilities. If you leverage this model, this approach, you can see that you can map in capabilities from different vendors with different solutions to solve different problems and still continue to have the understanding, continuity, and context of what issues you're actually fixing. So let's look at like NetApp. Well, NetApp doesn't necessarily do authentication. So in this case, we use Microsoft Azure AD. The device could be managed by anybody or on any platform with any solution set. The network is basically taking this compromise. The network is the network. Again, that policy engine's doing its thing, using intelligence and automation with all those other capabilities at the bottom there to allow access to a resource, which is the NetApp private and public cloud microcore. But they have 15 or 20 different capabilities. You can see that they're all easily mapped in here so that you can understand from authentication to the resource what goes where to solve that problem. Just Microsoft. Microsoft has got a lot of capabilities in this space. People get confused because of all the offerings that are there, but you can easily understand how that's applied in this context. Azure AD does the authentication. Microsoft Intune is doing the device security. The network is the network. Again, we don't necessarily know, so it's considered contested. Conditional access and identity governance are doing those things, powered by intelligence and automation with the stuff at the bottom there, ultimately to allow a decision to be made, a control to be applied to get towards those resources. And in the middle of that, Microsoft has applied another level of control with Cloud App if it's going to go to a resource in the cloud, or on-prem if it's going to go to stuff on-prem. It's got Microsoft information protection. But regardless, the point being, understanding this flow, understanding how this works, you can see which controls, which technologies, which solutions are applied where to solve what problem, even with vendors that have massive capability offerings in the space. And lastly, one more example, just to really dial this in for folks, is even if you look at somebody like Symantec, who's got lots of capabilities that has been a legacy security provider, you can also easily understand how this works. Symantec VIP takes care of my MFA. Endpoint security takes care of my device. There's also the gateway stuff. Again, the network is considered compromised. We don't manage, maintain, or control it. The policy engine's using intelligence and automation along with all those other things at the bottom to allow the decision. A control is applied, and then the resource is allowed. Now, Symantec does something that Microsoft does where they actually apply another level of control between the policy engine and the resource itself, whether it's in the cloud, whether it's on-prem, whether it's off-prem, whether it's email. Regardless, the point is lots of capability, lots of technology, lots of things that are applied across the entirety of this life cycle. and you can take other vendor solutions and plug them into each individual piece of this context. So that's kind of where we are in the space today. If you think about the history of ZT, you probably have I would hope, have a little bit of a better understanding now of where this came from, the strategy that's being applied there and the benefits that are allowed or actually allotted, and then an understanding of why this is a different approach to applying vendor solutions and controls to solve problems in your infrastructure. And I can say unequivocally, because of all the research we've done in this space, if you look at the entirety of what's available in the cybersecurity market, everything can be mapped into this model so that you can understand and leverage this capability across that life cycle to solve the problems for people using devices on networks to get to resources. And with that, I'll bring the guys back on from overseas.
Well, thank you very much. What do you think is the biggest challenge now if a company decides to really apply CT? How should they start?
Yeah, so I think there's a maturity curve to this, right? Where if you're an organization that has been in the banking or heavily regulated industry for a long time, you probably are solving a lot of these problems to begin with. And that's where you start solving things like data security, encryption, those type of things. However, the majority of us should really focus first on solving relatively simplistic problems like passwords, identity, access control, and devices. And if you can't solve for those, you need to fix those first, because that is where compromises occur. So my suggestion would be make sure that you first have a bulletproof identity and access management program and a bulletproof device security and control program, and work your way forward from there. Because in the history of exploitation, no one has ever just hacked a firewall. They get a user, they get a device to get to a piece of infrastructure.
Excellent. You mentioned that a password is a like single most important problem. How do you think are we going to get rid of that thing?
Well, a lot of organizations are moving towards elimination of the password. It's mainly going to be a combination of some form of auth with probably biometrics or at least a master password. Like me personally, we at Forrester moved to this model of no password back in January. And for me, I do multi-band authentication on my phone, but it also uses my Face ID. So I have one password for all of my accounts, single sign-on. As long as there's, like I said, there's no anomalies, then it just basically says, this looks normal, that's definitely Chase's face, allow the authentication. And that's where we're getting to, is where you're always going to have some form of authentication. It should be bulletproof, but you're going to have some limitation of the number of passwords you have to have, because that's where the nightmare comes in.
Okay. Well, we were able to ask a few questions. We got a few answers on. Unfortunately, we had a problem with connectivity. Nevertheless, I was more than happy and to hear how we should sort of start that journey towards zero trust. And number one, and number two, that we need to make sure that we really apply that and follow through to the very end. Chase, thank you very much for your presentation. It was a pleasure having you, and I wish you a good day.
Thank you so much for having me.
And then for the others, I'll switch back to Swiss German und komme zurück aufs Thema Homeoffice. Wir haben es vorher im Vortrag von Chase gehört, dass Homeoffice bei uns ja ähnlich wie in den USA durchaus ein grosses Thema ist. Und wir haben auch gesehen bei verschiedensten Kunden, dass wir verschiedenste Setups haben, zum Teil mit der Infrastruktur von der Firma, zum Teil ohne, zum Teil eher ein bisschen improvisiert. Und wir haben uns ein bisschen die Frage gestellt, wie das verdaut worden ist. Und da gibt es zwei Aspekte von dieser ganzen Geschichte. Der eine Aspekt ist sicher die IT, das ist das, was uns da in dieser WebEx am meisten betrifft, glaube ich. Aber Homeoffice hat natürlich auch eine zweite Komponente. Das sind nämlich die Personalseiten, die wir haben. Wie war die Führung gewesen? Wie haben die Leute können arbeiten? Sind sie zufrieden gewesen? Wie war der soziale Austausch gewesen? Also ganz relevante Themen im Bereich Zufriedenheit und am Ende aus Sicht von der Firma natürlich auch Performance. Wir haben zu dem Zweck ein Produkt zusammengestellt, einen Fragebogen mit Analyse, wo wir herausfinden wollen, welchen Einfluss das Homeoffice gehabt hat und immer noch hat, jetzt bedingt durch Corona, und noch viel mehr, was wir davon lernen können. Also was heisst das für den Normalbetrieb? Ich glaube, es hat geheißen, Digitalisierung, die wichtigste Rolle in der Firma war Covid und nicht der CIO. Was können wir lernen für den Normalbetrieb? Was haben sich die Leute daran gewöhnt? Was finden sie gut? Was ein bisschen weniger? Und die zweite Frage, die man sicher muss stellen, ist, wenn wieder eine ähnliche Krise kommt, was müssen wir machen, dass wir für den Moment so aufgestellt sind, dass wir möglichst einen kleinen Impact haben auf unseren Geschäftsalltag. Wir haben zu dem Zweck eine Umfrage via Webtool vorbereitet. Wir würden, wenn Sie das wünschen, nachher das auch auswerten durch HR-Spezialisten und IT-Spezialisten, darüber eine SWOT-Analyse machen und Handlungsempfehlungen abgeben. Selbstverständlich findet das Thema Zero-Trust auf der IT-Seite sehr, sehr grossen Eingang, aber wichtig auch, dass Sie auf der anderen Seite hören, was das auf der HR-Seite für Sie bedeutet, damit wir alle zusammen für eine nächste Runde von Homeoffice sehr gut aufgestellt sind. Weitere Infos finden Sie unter dem eingeblendeten Link. Das wäre es schon gewesen. Wir werden im Anschluss für alle, die sich angemeldet haben, eine Aufnahme, den Link respektive zu der Aufnahme zustellen. Ich bedanke mich an dieser Stelle ganz herzlich, freue mich mit Inseia Sie weiter dürfen zu bedienen und wünsche Ihnen einen ganz schönen Tag. Ganz herzlichen Dank für die Aufmerksamkeit. Auf Wiedersehen.